On the 18th of October 1685, King Louis XIV signed a single document at the Palace of Fontainebleau, and by nightfall, roughly 1 million French Protestants understood that the country their families had defended for 4 generations no longer wanted them inside it. The Edict of Fontainebleau revoked 87 years of legal protection for France's reformed minority, the Huguenots, and it left them with a choice that barely qualified as one: convert to the Catholic Church and stay, or abandon land, workshops, and family graves and get out of France with whatever fit inside a single trunk. Historians still argue over the exact number who chose to leave, but the range sits somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 people, smuggled out through the ports of La Rochelle and Dieppe, walked over the Alps into Switzerland, floated down the Rhine into German states willing to take them in. A smaller stream, numbering only a few thousand, crossed the Atlantic and landed on the docks of Boston, New York, and Charleston, carrying French surnames that American record keepers would spend the next century reshaping into something that read as English. If your family has always claimed plain English or Scottish ancestry, and one surname in the paper trail sits a little strangely next to the rest, there is a real chance you are looking at a Huguenot line the family stopped explaining 3 or 4 generations ago. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The Huguenots were never a fringe movement inside France. At their peak in the 1560s, they numbered close to 2 million people, roughly 10% of the entire population, and they were disproportionately concentrated among merchants, printers, silversmiths, weavers, and skilled artisans in cities like La Rochelle, Rouen, Caen, Montauban, and Nimes. The movement traced back to the teachings of John Calvin, who had left France himself in the 1530s and settled in Geneva, and by the time the wars of religion tore through France between 1562 and 1598, Protestant and Catholic armies had fought each other to exhaustion across the French countryside. The Edict of Nantes, signed by Henry IV in 1598, ended the fighting by granting Huguenots freedom of worship, the right to hold public office, and control of roughly 200 fortified towns where they could defend themselves if the peace broke down again. For most of the 17th century that peace held, uneasily. Cardinal Richelieu stripped the Huguenots of their fortified towns in the 1620s, but left their religious rights intact. Louis XIV inherited a kingdom he wanted unified under one crown, one law, and one church, and over the following decades he chipped away at Huguenot protections one royal decree at a time, closing their schools, barring them from certain professions, and stationing troops inside Protestant households under a policy the French called the dragonnades, using the presence of armed soldiers in a family's home as a tool of forced conversion. By the time the Edict of Fontainebleau made the persecution official in 1685, thousands of Huguenot families had already fled. The edict simply removed any legal ambiguity about what would happen to the ones who stayed. Huguenot pastors were given 2 weeks to leave the country or face execution. Ordinary Protestant citizens were technically forbidden to leave at all, which meant that most of the exodus that followed moved entirely outside the law, families slipping out of French ports at night on fishing boats, walking through the Pyrenees into Spain, or paying smugglers to hide them under cargo on ships bound for Amsterdam and London. The refugees who reached England, the Netherlands, and the German Principality of Brandenburg were absorbed quickly into the existing Protestant populations there, and it is from these secondary way stations, not directly from France, that most of the Huguenots who eventually reached the American colonies actually departed. A family might spend 2 years in London before boarding a ship for Boston, and by the time the ship's manifest was written, the surname had often already picked up an English spelling from a customs clerk who had never seen it in French. The American colonies received Huguenots in 4 distinct waves and 4 distinct places, and each left a different genealogical fingerprint. New York received the earliest and largest concentration. In 1688, a group of Huguenot refugees purchased land from the Huguenot people along the Long Island Sound and named their settlement New Rochelle, after La Rochelle, the fortified Atlantic port that had been the last stronghold of French Protestantism before Richelieu's armies took it in 1628. A decade earlier, in 1678, a separate group of a dozen Huguenot families had settled further up the Hudson Valley and founded New Paltz, where the stone houses they built along what is now called Huguenot Street still stand, among the oldest surviving structures in the United States. Manhattan itself absorbed a smaller but influential Huguenot population, including the family of Etienne de Lancey, who arrived as a teenager with almost nothing and built one of the largest trading fortunes in colonial New York, a fortune whose descendants would go on to serve as royal governors of the colony. Boston received a smaller stream, but a disproportionately consequential one. Apollos Rivoire arrived from the Bordeaux region as a young apprentice goldsmith in the early 1700s, and by the time he had established his own silversmithing business in Boston, he had anglicized his surname to Revere, a name his son Paul would carry into American history 2 generations later on a midnight ride most Americans learn about in school without ever hearing the word Huguenot attached to it. Peter Faneuil, whose family had fled France by way of the Netherlands, built the market hall in Boston that still bears his name and still hosts town meetings today, the largest and most durable Huguenot settlement in the colonies formed in South Carolina. Charleston's Huguenot population grew large enough, fast enough, that by the 1690s it supported its own French-language congregation, the French Huguenot Church, which still holds services in Charleston today and remains the only independent Huguenot congregation left in continuous operation in the United States. Families with names like Manigault, Legare, Huger, Ravenel, Gaillard, Porcher, Priolot, Trappier, Dutartre, and Mazique built rice and indigo plantations along the Cooper and Santee rivers, intermarried with the English planter class within 2 generations, and became so thoroughly woven into Charleston's colonial aristocracy that by the American Revolution, Huguenot surnames sat at the center of South Carolina's political leadership. Henry Laurens, whose grandfather had fled La Rochelle, served as president of the Continental Congress. Francis Marion, remembered by American schoolchildren as the Swamp Fox for his guerrilla campaigns against British forces, descended from Huguenot refugee Gabriel Marion, who had settled in South Carolina decades earlier. A 4th and smaller Huguenot settlement took root in Virginia. At a bend in the James River, the colony granted specifically to a group of refugee families in 1700, a place they called Manikin Town. The Reverend James Fontaine, who led part of that migration, left behind a memoir describing the crossing in detail, and his descendants, along with families named Trabue, Chastain, Maury, Dupuis, and Salle, spread out from the Manikin Town settlement into the Virginia Piedmont over the following century. One of those Maury descendants, Matthew Fontaine Maury, would later become known as the father of modern oceanography, a fact almost never connected in popular memory to a French Protestant refugee who crossed the Atlantic under royal persecution a century and a half earlier. The erasure of Huguenot identity in America happened through arithmetic more than through any single law or policy. Huguenot refugees arrived in the colonies in the low thousands at a time when the English colonial population already numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and a group that small, without a continuing source of new immigrants from France to replenish it, had exactly 2 paths available. Marry within an impossibly small pool of other French Protestant families for generations, the way the Amish and Mennonite communities would later manage in Pennsylvania, or marry into the surrounding English, Scottish, and Dutch population and disappear into it within 2 or 3 generations. Almost every Huguenot community in America chose, or was pushed into, the second path. In New York, the French Church of New York, known as the Église du Saint-Esprit, held services entirely in French through the early 1700s, but by the 1750s the congregation had shrunk enough that English had become the working language of Sunday worship, and by the American Revolution most descendants of the original New Rochelle and New Paltz families spoke no French at all. Surnames anglicized along the way in patterns genealogists can still trace today. Rivoire became Revere, Fauconnier became Falconer, and eventually, in some branches, simply Faulkner. Leroy, French for the king, became king outright in several documented family lines. Dubois, meaning of the wood, became Wood or Dewey's, depending on which county clerk recorded the family. De la Tour dropped its particle and became Latour or simply Tower. LeBlanc, meaning the white one, became White in at least 2 documented South Carolina lines. Some families kept their French names intact, but let the pronunciation drift so far from the original that the spelling and the sound no longer matched. Legare, still spelled the French way in Charleston today, is pronounced Legree by most of its own descendants, who no longer know the sound is a corruption. Huger, one of the most prominent Huguenot names in South Carolina history, is pronounced Ug, with the French consonants dropped entirely. Pettigrew, a name that produced one of antebellum South Carolina's most respected judges, began as a variant of Petit Gru, meaning little gray, before generations of English-speaking clerks and neighbors sanded the syllables down. Sevier, the surname of John Sevier, the first governor of the state of Tennessee, is said by his own family's tradition to have begun as Xavier, softened in pronunciation and spelling by the time Sevier led Tennessee frontiersmen into battle at Kings Mountain during the Revolution. None of it required a decree. It moved one wedding, one baptism record, one tax roll at a time, across a population too small to resist the pull of the English-speaking majority around it, until within 3 generations most Huguenot families in America had an English surname, an English-speaking household, and a family Bible that no longer mentioned where the name had come from. Genetic genealogists tracking Huguenot descent face a problem the researchers of larger, more isolated colonial populations never had to solve. Those populations stayed large enough and isolated enough for 150 to 250 years that their genetic signal held its shape. Huguenot families in America did the opposite. They intermarried into the surrounding population so quickly, and in such small original numbers, that the French genetic contribution to any single descendant today is usually a thin thread buried under 9 or 10 generations of English, Scottish, Dutch, and German ancestry. A person with a documented Huguenot ancestor 8 generations back may carry less than 1% of that ancestor's genome, diluted by ordinary inheritance, long before any DNA test could isolate it as a distinct regional signal. This is why most Huguenot descendants who take a commercial DNA test never see the word France appear on their results at all. Consumer ancestry companies report broad regional categories built from modern reference populations, and a fraction of French ancestry small enough gets folded silently into the general Western Europe or British Isles category, the same way a small Welsh or German thread can vanish into a larger regional average. The signal that does survive lives on the Y chromosome, passed father to son largely unchanged across hundreds of generations, and in mitochondrial DNA, passed mother to daughter the same way, rather than in the broad autosomal percentages most people check first. The Huguenot DNA Project, an ongoing genetic genealogy effort that collects Y DNA results from men who can document an unbroken paternal line back to a named Huguenot refugee, has built out haplotype profiles for dozens of documented Huguenot surnames, comparing American descendants against DNA collected from men still living in the specific regions of France the refugees originally left, places like Poitou, Aunis, Saintonge, and Normandy. A man who can trace his surname back to a Huguenot refugee from La Rochelle, and who carries a Y-DNA haplogroup matching modern samples from that same coastal region of France, is holding genetic evidence a paper trail alone cannot provide, a direct biological link surviving underneath 400 years of anglicized spelling and forgotten language. The historian John Butler, whose 1983 study of Huguenot assimilation remains the standard academic account of the group's disappearance into American life, argued that the Huguenots vanished from popular historical memory not because their numbers were insignificant, but because they succeeded almost completely at the one thing most persecuted refugee groups struggle to do. They blended in, generation by generation, until within 2 lifetimes their own descendants had largely forgotten there was ever anything to blend in from. That speed is the detail most family trees never account for. A Huguenot refugee who reached Charleston or New Rochelle in the 1690s usually had a grandchild born by the 1720s or 1730s who carried an English surname on one side of the family and had never set foot in a French-speaking household. Compare that to the 2, sometimes 3 centuries other closed colonial populations took to blend into the American mainstream, and the Huguenot disappearance looks less like slow assimilation and more like a controlled demolition of a distinct identity, finished within a single human lifetime. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The pressure to assimilate was social and legal at once. English colonial law did not automatically extend the same property and inheritance rights to foreign-born Protestants that it granted to English subjects, which meant that a Huguenot refugee arriving in New York or South Carolina in the 1690s existed in a kind of legal limbo, permitted to worship and work, but not fully entitled to own land, testify in court, or pass property to his children without special legislative action. South Carolina addressed this directly in 1697, when its colonial assembly passed one of the earliest naturalization acts in English America, specifically to grant Huguenot refugees the full legal rights of English subjects, a measure the colony's leadership pushed through, partly out of welcome, and partly because it needed the Huguenots' agricultural and commercial skill to keep growing its rice economy. New York moved slower and less generously, and Huguenot families there spent decades petitioning individually for naturalization, each petition a small, documented moment of a family formally exchanging a French legal identity for an English one. Every one of those petitions still exists in colonial archives, and a genealogist researching a Huguenot line today can often find the exact year, sometimes the exact month, when an ancestor formally became, on paper, an Englishman. The pressure ran through the church as well as through the courthouse. Huguenot congregations that wanted their ministers recognized by the colonial establishment and their marriages and baptisms considered legally valid increasingly had to affiliate with the Church of England rather than maintain independent Calvinist worship. In South Carolina, the French Huguenot Church managed to remain independent, but many individual Huguenot families joined the Anglican parish churches anyway, for the simple reason that full participation in colonial political and social life ran through the established church, and a family that wanted its sons eligible for public office needed an Anglican baptismal record to prove it. Every practical advantage in colonial life, land titles, court standing, church membership, and eventually intermarriage into the established planter and merchant families, rewarded a French Protestant family for becoming indistinguishable from its English neighbors, and offered little but isolation to a family that insisted on remaining separate. The historian Bertrand van Rumbeke, whose research on the South Carolina Huguenot community remains among the most detailed available, described the process as one of the fastest and most complete assimilations of any immigrant group in early American history, faster even than the group's own descendants, 2 and 3 generations later, seemed to fully register was happening to them. What survives of that assimilation today rarely comes from official records. It comes from fragments passed down inside families who no longer entirely understand what they are holding. Local historical societies in Charleston, New Rochelle, and the old Monacantown district of Virginia have spent decades collecting family recollections from descendants who grew up hearing a single sentence repeated at holidays, usually from a grandmother or a great-aunt, and usually without further explanation. "We were French once." The sentence turns up, in nearly identical form, across unrelated family collections held by the National Huguenot Society and its regional chapters, offered by descendants whose own surnames carry no obvious French trace at all, names like Ford, Wood, King, Bird, or Grant, families who had long since stopped connecting the sentence to any specific ancestor until a genealogist traced the paper trail backward through a marriage record, a naturalization petition, or a will written in a hand that spelled a name differently than the family had ever seen it spelled. The National Huguenot Society, which verifies documented lineage for descendants who wish to formally join, receives a steady stream of applications each year from people who began their research with nothing more than that half-remembered family sentence and a surname that felt, to them, slightly wrong. Some of those applications end in confirmed documentation stretching back to a named refugee who left La Rochelle or Rouen in the 1680s. Others end in a dead branch, a record that does not survive, a name that vanished from the paper trail 2 or 3 generations before any surviving document could confirm or deny the family story. Family historians working with the Society's regional chapters describe the same pattern over and over. The families who remembered anything at all usually remembered the fact of French ancestry without remembering the specific name, the specific town, or the specific reason the family had left, because by the time the memory was being passed down at all, it had already survived 2 centuries of an American culture with no particular use for a story about Protestant refugees from a war most Americans had never been taught to know existed. New Jersey and Pennsylvania absorbed a smaller Huguenot stream that genealogists sometimes overlook entirely because it arrived without a founding settlement the way New Rochelle or Monacantown had one. Elias Boudinot's family had already been in America for 2 generations by the time he was born in Philadelphia in 1740, descended from a Huguenot refugee named Élie Boudinot who had fled France for New York in the 1680s before the family moved south into New Jersey. Elias Boudinot went on to serve as president of the Continental Congress, the man who officially signed the treaty ending the Revolutionary War on behalf of the United States, and later became the first director of the United States Mint under George Washington, a fact rarely paired in popular history with the detail that his great-grandfather had walked out of France a century earlier rather than renounce his faith. The Bayard family followed a similar path, arriving in New Amsterdam before the English took the colony and renamed it New York, and producing generations of merchants, judges, and eventually United States senators who carried the name into the 19th century without most of their neighbors ever connecting it to the French Protestant refugee who first brought it across the Atlantic. Delaware picked up a smaller Huguenot presence as well, arriving through Philadelphia and drifting south along the same roads that carried German and Scots-Irish settlers into the mid-Atlantic backcountry, and family names like Vezin, Latimus, and Cazier still turn up in Delaware genealogical records today. thinned out by 3 centuries of intermarriage but traceable, for anyone willing to follow the paper back far enough, to a specific parish in a specific region of France. Taken together, the New York, Boston, Virginia, South Carolina, and Mid-Atlantic settlements account for the great majority of documented Huguenot lines in America, and the surname list built from all 5 runs long: Revere, Faneuil, Delancey, J. Boudinot, Bayard, Manigault, Legare, Huger, Ravenel, Gaillard, Marion, Lawrence, Pettigrew, Sevier, Fontaine, Maury, Trabouet, Chastain, Dutart, Trappier, Priolo, Porcher, Mazic. Some of those names still look and sound French today. Others have been worn down by 4 centuries of English pronunciation until almost nothing of the original remains, which is exactly why so many descendants never think to look for a French refugee sitting at the root of an ordinary English-sounding family tree. For anyone watching who wants to check their own line, the practical trail usually starts in the same 3 or 4 places. A family paper trail that runs through colonial New York, coastal South Carolina, or the James River Valley in Virginia before 1750 is the single strongest geographic indicator, since those were the 4 places Huguenot refugees actually settled in organized numbers, rather than scattering evenly across the 13 colonies the way later immigrant groups sometimes did. A surname that does not translate cleanly into any obvious English, Scottish, Irish, or German root, but also does not look conventionally French anymore, is the second indicator, because that is exactly the shape 4 centuries of anglicization leaves behind, a name too worn down to look foreign, but never quite settling into a familiar English pattern either. A family story mentioning France, a French church, or an ancestor who would not convert, is the third, and it is worth taking seriously even when no other detail survives with it, because the Huguenot Society's own intake records show that vague fragment turning into confirmed documentation, often enough that genealogists treat it as a real lead rather than folklore. For descendants who take the additional step of Y-DNA testing through a paternal line, and who can document that line back to a specific colonial-era surname, the Huguenot DNA Project offers a way to compare results against modern French reference populations from the specific regions the refugees actually left, a comparison that a standard autosomal test, built for broad regional percentages rather than deep single-line ancestry, is simply not designed to make. None of this produces certainty on its own. Colonial genealogy rarely does. But taken together, a place, a worn surname, a half-remembered family sentence, and in some cases a matching Y-DNA signal from the Atlantic coast of France, form the same kind of layered evidence this channel has traced through other buried American bloodlines. Evidence that does not announce itself in a single document, but accumulates, generation by generation, until the pattern becomes difficult to explain any other way. Go back to the document Louis XIV signed at Fontainebleau in 1685, and what it actually reveals 4 centuries later is a story about how completely a population can vanish from public memory while still surviving, almost intact, inside the family trees of people who have no idea they are carrying it, a deeper story than the religious persecution that started it. Nobody produces a television special about Huguenot heritage the way networks have covered Irish or Italian immigration, because the Huguenots stopped looking distinct within 3 generations of arriving, and a population that disappears that completely leaves behind surnames rather than neighborhoods, court petitions rather than living communities, a handful of church buildings in Charleston and New Paltz rather than an ethnic identity anyone still claims out loud on a census form. But the surnames are still there, sitting inside American family trees, exactly where the refugees left them 400 years ago, some of them barely changed. Manigault, Legare, Huger, Ravenel, Boudinot, Gaillard, Marion, Dutart, Trappier, Priolo, and some of them changed so completely that only a genealogist tracing a specific document backward would ever connect Revere to Rivoire, or King to Leroy, or White to Leblanc, or Faulkner to Fauconnier, or Sevier to Lexavier. If one of those names, or something close to it, sits somewhere in your own family tree, alongside a paper trail that runs back through New York, South Carolina, New Jersey, or the James River Valley in Virginia to the late 1600s or early 1700s, the odds are real that you are looking at a Huguenot line, a family that once stood inside a French Protestant congregation in La Rochelle or Rouen, watched the crown of France declare its religion illegal, and crossed an ocean rather than convert. What happened after that crossing unfolded slowly, over generations, families choosing survival over distinctiveness again and again, a wedding at a time, a naturalization petition at a time, a baptism recorded in English instead of French, until the choice itself disappeared from memory along with the language, the church records, and in many branches the surname itself. What remained was a family Bible nobody could fully explain, a grandmother's half-sentence about being French once, and, buried far enough down in the genome that no consumer DNA test was ever built to find it easily, a thread running back to the Atlantic coast of France, and a decision made under royal decree in 1685. The refugees who carried that thread across the ocean did not survive by staying visible. They survived by disappearing into the country that took them in, so completely that their own great-great-grandchildren grew up believing they were simply plainly American, with no further explanation required. 400 years on, the explanation is still sitting there, in a surname, in a county record, in a Y-DNA match to a village outside La Rochelle that a family has not thought about since the 17th century, waiting for someone in that family to finally go looking for it. There was a sixth settlement, smaller than the rest and less often mentioned, that shows just how fragile these communities could be, even when the refugees tried to stay together on purpose. In 1686, a group of Huguenot families attempted to establish a colony near present-day East Greenwich, Rhode Island, a place they called Frenchtown, hoping to recreate something like the closed, self-sustaining farming villages they had left behind in western France. The attempt lasted barely a decade. English settlers already held competing claims to the same land, colonial courts sided against the French families in the resulting disputes, and by the 1690s most of the Frenchtown refugees had scattered south into Rhode Island's English towns, or joined the larger, better-established communities in New York and Boston. Almost nothing physical remains of Frenchtown today, beyond a scatter of place names and a handful of stone foundations local historians have mapped over the years. But the families who passed through it, names like Hérault, Bernot, and Lemoine, went on to leave descendants across New England under surnames that, once again, no longer announce where they came from. Frenchtown's failure is, in its own way, the clearest evidence of how little room colonial America actually gave a small refugee population to remain separate, even when that population wanted to. Every attempt to stay distinct ran into the same wall of demographics, legal pressure, and simple intermarriage, and every one of those attempts eventually gave way to the same familiar outcome, a name absorbed, a language lost, and a bloodline that kept moving steadily forward under cover of an ordinary English surname nobody in the neighborhood ever thought twice about. That is the pattern this whole story keeps returning to, whether the setting is a rice plantation on the Cooper River, a silversmith's workshop in Boston, a courthouse in colonial New York filing a naturalization petition, or a failed farming village outside East Greenwich. A refugee crosses an ocean carrying a name, a faith, and a reason for leaving that the family eventually stops repeating out loud, and 3 or 4 generations later a descendant who has never once heard the word Huguenot looks at a DNA result, or a strangely spelled surname on an old deed, or a single half-remembered line in a grandmother's Bible, and wonders, for the first time in a very long while, where any of it actually came from. Somewhere in a family tree that has never once used the word France, that name is usually still waiting, spelled just strangely enough, pronounced just carefully enough by an aunt or uncle who never fully explained why, to be worth a second, closer look. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.